Hi everyone, let's begin our talk about direct and indirect measures of assessment. Assessment is that dreaded A word. A lot of educators and definitely students have sort of a love-hate relationship with assessment. Assessments are also referred to as measures and tests. They're synonymous. We love assessments in that we want to know how our students are doing. We as learners want to know how we are doing. At the same time, when an assessment doesn't really measure what we're supposed to be learning, it can be something that we resent and is very frustrating. Ineffective assessments do not measure learning, and we know that there are ineffective assessments out there to test if we know what we're supposed to know or if we can do what we've been asked to learn. And sometimes we use assessments to predict our success or others' success in one area or another in the future. And if we don't make the right choice in assessment, it will not be very predictive. These are the kinds of things that lead us to hate or get frustrated with assessments, tests, or measures. Using assessments that were not created to assess or measure specific intended learning or student learning outcomes are also not effective. So let's talk about assessing learning, focusing on the word learning, not just assessing for the sake of assessing. Assessments are supposed to measure what we've learned. We can assess learning that has been specifically outlined and defined. When you know exactly what someone is supposed to have learned and to what extent, it's easier to create an assessment and to utilize it. I want my students to learn the benefits of yoga for their lives. That's one learning outcome that someone can write. Or, I want my students to learn to effectively do the 10 fundamental yoga techniques that improve core strength and reduce stress. Now we've got some meat on the bones of that learning outcome or learning objective. We know the goal, and if we're taking over for that teacher, or if we are the teacher and we create it ourselves, we now know exactly what it is we're supposed to be assessing or measuring. Based on what outcome statement is provided, which outcome statement is provided, a teacher will devise their curriculum plans differently. So whenever anyone takes over a course that's been written by someone else, they look at the objectives and the outcomes, and from there, they draw their lesson plan and then assess if people are learning what they're supposed to learn. For number one, or for that first outcome, different teachers will likely vary significantly. What do you mean by benefiting their lives? There are so many ways in which that can be interpreted. It's very subjective. Not only that, the teachers aren't necessarily wrong if they interpret it vastly differently because meat hasn't been given to that to that outcome. There's no specificity to it. Also, a student may read that outcome and think that they know what it is that they need to do, and after the assessment realize, oh, that's what they were looking at, because it wasn't specific. Each teacher will likely interpret this differently, which means the learning will vary significantly. Also, that they will assess the learning differently. People who take the same class may therefore learn vastly different things and may be assessed quite divergently. So you can imagine in the case of the yoga class, you could have 4 different sections of the same yoga class going with the I want my students to learn the benefits of yoga for their lives outcome, and they could all come out with very different learning even though they signed up for the same course. So assessing specific learning is critical. I want my students to learn effectively I want my students to learn to effectively do the 10 fundamental yoga techniques that improve core strength and reduce stress. You can see we've emphasized here the words that give it specificity. For outcome statement number 2, the concepts of effective, 10 fundamental techniques, core strength, and stress reduction all communicate to learners and teachers what they're supposed to cover and therefore what they need to assess to see if the learning has occurred. They communicate more specific learning goals to learners and teachers and guide the teacher to teach and measure very specific things or outcomes. So overcoming the disdain or the hatred for testing. Tests or assessments are dirty words among some educators and learners. What I'm hoping you get out of this very short presentation is don't hate the test. Really think about where it came from. Oftentimes people are just choosing the wrong test as a predictor, and we resent the test when in fact it's just a misapplication. Key issues. Do the tests measure what they aim to measure and what really matters? For example, the SAT measures a baseline of knowledge in 3 areas of math, reading, and writing. The SAT does not measure knowledge in other areas of future college study or emotional and interpersonal aptitude. So we know that the SAT cannot predict success for students in all ways. Assessments, measures, or tests do 3 things. They assess if learning has occurred. They measure how well a learning experience is teaching the material. And they communicate to learners how they're doing. We oftentimes forget that when we post grades, we're communicating to students how well they're doing. Are they getting it? Are they moving in the right direction? Have you created assessments that actually measure the learning outcome? When outcomes are clear and specific, assessments can be easy to create. Tests, measures are easy to create when you know what the intended outcome is. If your assessments show that students are not learning as you had planned, the issue is not in the test. It's time to revise the curriculum learning plan. Now let's talk about direct and indirect measures. How can we be sure we measure what we meant to measure? Direct measures of assessment will ensure that. Direct versus indirect assessments of measures of learning. Direct measures directly assess learning. I know it sounds really obvious, but the truth is they are a direct assessment of the learning. You can look at the lesson plan, the learning that took place, and measure it, and you can see the direct link. Indirect measures tell us something about the learning experience, but are not directly linked to the acquisition of specific knowledge or skills. We'll talk about some examples in a few minutes and it will be more clear. Direct and indirect measures are yoga example. A teacher teaches a yoga pose, then assesses if each learner can do the pose well. This is a direct measure of learning. You teach downward facing dog and all the aspects of that one needs to know, including the positioning, how you get into that position, the breathing that needs to take place in that position, etc. Then you have the learner do it, and you measure how successfully they did that. A very clear, direct measure. Also, we can ask students after the yoga class if they effectively learned to do the pose downward facing dog. They could say yes, they could say no. That's an indirect measure. Their response is based on their perception of how well they learned the pose. A perfectionist in the same class may say that they did not learn it well enough, while another classmate from that same class on the mat right next to them may be very pleased that they managed the pose at all. They may be in their first yoga class ever or struggle with matters of balance and breathing and core strength. You could have 2 people tell you that they learned it well or not from the same class with the same instruction. It's not a direct measure. It's their perception. It's still important, but not for measuring learning, but for measuring different aspects of the learning experience. They each define effective learning differently, and they each likely had different expectations. A survey question does not ever measure learning. It measures perceptions of learning and the learning experience, which is valuable, but not when we're trying to determine if learning actually occurred. Surveys are indirect measures of learning. So let's talk about some specific direct and indirect measures. Essay questions on exams or as discussion prompts are usually direct measures, especially if you write the question in such a way that it speaks specifically to asking them to discuss how to apply a key term that they learned or concept. Multiple choice test questions are direct measures, especially when they relate back to specific readings or assignments or activities in the class. Oral or technology-based presentations like Prezis or this video presentation here and performance pieces are direct measures, ways in which students prove that they learned what they were supposed to learn and to what degree. Term papers, portfolio and poster presentations, capstone and class projects, whether they're individual or group, are all direct measures of students demonstrating that they have learned what they were supposed to learn and to what extent. Standardized tests are pretty obvious direct measures. However, if the learning hasn't taken place and the test is taken, then we know about learning, but not necessarily learning to the test. So sometimes people will teach to a test, and we oftentimes criticize that. There's nothing wrong with teaching to a test as long as you don't lose sight of teaching to all the other areas in which you need to cover. But if you know someone's going to have to engage in an assessment to predict their future and to impact their lives, then including teaching to the test allows you to specifically directly measure learning. State and national licensure, certification, and professional examinations, like standardized tests, are direct measures. Oftentimes those are less controversial than standardized tests because usually you have to go through an MPH health education program or a JD program or a medical program or something that ends with a licensure, certification, or professional exam. That program teaches to that exam, certainly well beyond that, and then they measure to see if you're competent to work within the field so that we as consumers know that we're getting licensed practitioners. I think most of us would not go to urgent care, a doctor, or a lawyer if they hadn't passed those exams. We're perfectly comfortable with direct measures in instances where our lives are at stake. Internship performance. If there are specific things that someone's supposed to be able to do, like behave ethically, fill out particular forms appropriately, etc., and we measure their ability to do that, it's a direct measure. Finally, pre and post tests. You can see what they knew before the learning occurred and what they know afterwards, and it shows a level of learning that is considered an excellent direct measure. Now let's talk about indirect measures. All those formative assessments that we've talked about before, such as muddiest point assessments and different formative assessments along the way that a teacher uses to help inform their teaching and to understand where the students are at, but that are not used to grade the student, that are oftentimes used to assess their perception or their feelings about something so that we can improve how we're teaching. All the surveys that we do of current students, faculty members, internship supervisors, graduates of, or alumni, employers, transfer institutions when we want to learn how our students are doing. If it's a survey, not if it's an assessment of their skills, but if it's a survey of how generally those folks do, it's not a direct measure, it's an indirect measure. Maybe a school wants to know how well their graduates in general do when they transfer to work for Boeing or Google or a particular university. They don't know specific learning occurred through that, but they can get a sense for how professional they are or how well they are received within that employer's context. Final course grades are indirect measures, unless the course or learning experience only set out to teach one learning outcome. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Applying direct and indirect measures. One assessment does not fit all outcomes. An example learning outcome is here. Upon successful completion of this class, learners will be able to understand, explain, and demonstrate the application of the profession's ethical guidelines. We've got 3 levels of Bloom here, so we've probably got 3 assessments, at least 2. How might we assess the basic understanding of a concept? Multiple choice questions, essay questions, essay responses, or oral presentations. So the understanding part, do they understand the main tenets of the ethical requirements of this profession? We could use any of these direct assessments to assess that. Now, when we get into explaining an application, oftentimes multiple choice and essay questions are not necessarily the right way to go, unless they're very well crafted. How might we assess if they can explain a concept? An essay or discussion question could do it with the right prompts that allow you to assess them, usually with good rubrics. An oral presentation or a pre-recorded video-based presentation done by the learner can certainly let us know if they have the ability to explain the professional ethical guidelines. Part of a term paper assignment, maybe it's the entire term paper assignment. If there are specific requirements for them to explain their profession's ethical guidelines, then you could directly assess that with that kind of assignment. Now let's talk about application. How might we assess if students can apply the concept in a relevant setting? Maybe there's a final project or part of a final project that requires students to show how they would create a confidentiality statement and how they would explain that confidentiality statement to a potential client. Internship performance assessments as well. I've worked with several programs in which students have to work with clients. They're supervised, and some have been withdrawn from the program by the administrators because of unethical conduct that they had learned about in the past. So these are direct measures of their ability to apply what they have learned or their inability to do so. Final note on final grades and pre-test, post-tests. Why are final grades not direct assessments? This is usually a common question. We go through a whole course, in the end we have an A, an A minus, a C plus, a B, a D. Why isn't that a direct assessment? I did a bunch of multiple choice exams, quizzes. I had some essay questions in there, some discussion questions online. How is that final grade, therefore, since it's a compilation of all of that, not a direct assessment? Well, with final grades, they incorporate oftentimes factors not related to learning, including attendance points, participation, extra credit. Once you start adding pieces like that, they're not about learning. They're about earning points for other factors to help a student get a better grade if they've earned it. They're also a cumulative assessment based on performance on multiple measures assessing multiple outcomes. So someone could be excellent at all of their essay responses. They are earning attendance points. They may be very good at the performance, but each time they took a quiz, they earned a C plus, B minus, and yet everything else was an A. In the end, they earned an A minus. The A minus communicates that they're an A minus in everything. And yet if you break it down into the different areas, in some ways they were very strong, and in other ways they were average or just slightly above or below average. A final grade can't really tell you their level of learning in different areas for that reason. It's a compilation of everything. Final grades are also frequently interpretive and largely subjective. You could have a student who struggles in the beginning and is earning maybe a C plus, B minus. Last 2/3 of the course, light bulb turns on, they really click into gear, they get it, they're motivated, and they do A work until the end. The points cumulatively in the end add up to an 89%. If one looks at the grade book, it looks like an 89. Well, it's a B plus. The instructor looks at it and says, you know what? They didn't get some of those key things in the beginning, but in the last 2/3 or 3/4 of the course, they got it all. And it's evidence that they actually did get the things that they weren't getting before. I'm going to give this student an A minus or maybe even an A. That final grade reflects the instructor's perception of how well they did, not of any one specific learning within that class of those outcomes or skills. Unless the final grade in a class is based on the direct assessment of one learning outcome, it is not a direct measure. So now, what's so great about pre and post tests, since we've emphasized those? They illustrate knowledge before and after learning takes place. They give us a baseline to understand our learners. They allow teachers to adjust lesson plans to encourage learning. They allow teachers to assess if they are doing the job of effectively teaching. Pre and post tests are great not only for you to know if the learning happened, but for you to be a better teacher. The limits of pre and post tests include the same questions on post testing are familiar and thus may be easier to recall and answer, especially if a very short period of time has passed between the pre and the post test. It doesn't mean that learning didn't happen. It just means that they've been predisposed to them, and so they're likely to do a bit better anyway. But if you're seeing grades going from the F and D range to the high B's, low A's, you know that there's probably something more going on than just familiarity. A test may only measure understanding or comprehension of some key terms rather than the application or evaluation of key concepts. So I may use a pre and a post test, but that doesn't necessarily mean it covers all of the learning outcomes of my course or my educational experience that I'm providing. So they can be fantastic, but they're limited to what you tested on. You may need more than pre and post tests. If what is taught is not reflected in the tests, learning may occur, but will not be reflected in the measure. So the point here is pre-tests and post-tests are great if they're actually written to reflect what was intended to be learned and taught. If not, you can do a pre-test, post-test and not have great scores because you didn't actually teach what you were pre- and post-testing on. One measure does not assess all learning. Consider multiple different types of measures: formative and summative assessments, direct measures, and